All right, let's pray. Amen. Amen. So, why we believe in creation, and as I told you in the prior weeks, that looking at this, and we're taking a little different approach than we've done in times past, looking at some of evidence outside of just Scripture, kind of evaluating what makes sense, evaluating, and we've been asking these questions and bringing these questions out and then say, what makes sense, creation or evolution? And that's where we've been putting the test to it. The ones we left off with last week, how did life begin? How did life begin? Does it make sense to think of evolution or creation? And then why did life begin? We looked at that, and then we left off with the next number 3 there. We just starting to get into that. How did various plants, such a variety of plants and animals, develop? We're not going to go back. We just want to keep looking at this because we got plenty to cover, and then we'll just move on. So, evolution's answer: how did such a variety of plants and animals develop? Evolution's answer is a simple cell evolved to more complex plants and animals through this process of time, chance, natural selection, mutations, and survival of the fittest over a period of billions of years. Just stretch it out. Stretch it out, stretch it out. So let's pick on Darwin a little bit more. Pick on Mr. Darwin. We got more about him tonight. But as you study his life, 1859, he writes The Origin of Species. When Darwin looked into the microscope of his day, and he looked at a cell, basically what he saw in the center of it, something that looked like fluid, and that's about all he could see because his microscope, only saw or was only amplified to hundreds of times, not like they have today where it's thousands of times of magnification. And so to him, a cell was just something very, very simple. And what we know now is that there is information in the cell, DNA within the cell. In fact, it's in every cell of your body, there's the DNA. In every cell of our body, there is DNA evidence. There's DNA within that, the evidence of life. Inside of this DNA is a very intricate pattern, the blueprint of amazing intelligence that goes from one cell and multiplies to 2 cells and then multiplies to 4 and keeps multiplying. And we can really see this multiplication or this development when you look at the development of a baby. It's just a fetus. Yeah, it's a fetus. Yeah, a fetus means a living little baby. Like Charlie Kirk, doesn't he bring that out? What does the word fetus mean? Because they always want to defer back and say, it's a fetus, not a baby. Well, a fetus, the word in Latin means a little baby. So if they want to say it's a fetus, like, exactly. Okay. But when you look at the process begins with fertilization. There's an egg released from the ovary of a female and penetrated by the sperm cell from the male, resulting in a zygote, develops through mitosis and cell differentiation, and the resulting embryo then implants itself in the uterus, where the embryo continues development through a fetal stage until birth. By the 5th week, there is a tiny heartbeat. By the 5th week, there's a tiny heartbeat in that tube, and that will beat 110 times per minute. By the time the baby reaches fetal stage, 8 weeks, they call it fetal stage at 8 weeks, all the major organs and body systems are developing. Hand and feet and eyes are visible, and ears begin to form. So they try to argue, those that say pro-choice, which is that's not a good term, but they try to say that's, they try to think of it as a positive spin and say it's pro-choice. We get to choose whether we keep the baby or kill the baby or do whatever. And they say, well, it's not viable until 20 weeks or 24 weeks. They say 24 weeks because that's the earliest. But they've saved babies at 20 weeks. 20 weeks, only 20 weeks, they've saved a baby outside, had to take it outside of the mother and put it in an incubator, saved at 20 weeks. That much development, and yet the baby survived. And so if you take a spoonful of DNA, all little liquid cells, it has more information, that little teaspoon, with all the evidence and all the information that's in DNA, and we'll get into that a little bit more later, than all the books, all the computers, and all the software that has ever been on the earth in all of time. A DNA has so much information in it. There's more information in a spoonful of DNA. Darwin looked at it, and it was just a simple cell. That's the basic building block of life. And so he made assumptions about that simple cell. And so now many people thought that life could just spontaneously occur. And you hear that. Well, maybe, with proteins and all these molecules and all the different, just time and lightning, and where'd lightning come from? Anyway, that life could spontaneously occur. But Louis Pasteur, interestingly, in 1860, proved that spontaneous generation, in other words, life cannot come from non-life. Life cannot come from non-life. Things that are not living, just rocks and dirt and all that, and then life is going to come out of it. The only way that life comes out of non-life is when God steps down, spits on it, makes a little clay, molds it together, and then he breathes in it the breath of life. That's how life comes from non-life. But scientifically, there's no life that comes from non-life. That's not been proven. There's no way it's been brought about. But this was a year after Darwin wrote his about saying life could come from non-life. So we have this assumption of the simple cell in his view of life, and then Pasteur's work. Darwin's view also, he was pretty honest about certain things. There was things he put out that were very honest if people would actually read what he said. And so he said, I can't understand how the human eye works, and the lens and the optic nerve. They all have to work simultaneously, so I don't understand how they can evolve in a way that they work. But his assumption was future scientists will learn more than I can see, and they'll figure out how this works. Little did he know that now we know that a housefly has 7,000 lenses in their eye, talking about complexity. There are a lot of different things that his presumptions about simple cell multiplying, how it really works, and actually the later science has disproven what he thought might be proven later on. He believed there were over 6.5 million. Now it's believed that there's over 6.5 million species in existence, and all of that came from the faithful statement would be from one single cell. Anyway, that's evolution. Creation says God created various plants, animals, and species in a harmonic balance to reflect his attributes and his character. Romans 1:20. I don't know if I put that in there for you. If not, you can write it down. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. He's saying even the things that we don't even see or understand, but we were created in God's image, and we can behold all of God's creation, from all of heavens to all the microscopic things, the wonderful things that God has created. We can see those things, and all of them shout out and say, God created. There is a divine creator. All of these things. The more you study it, as we get into this, the more that they put science to it, they cannot deny that it had to have a creator. So God says, I have created. When you look into the stars and the galaxies, when you go back to these ancient civilizations, there are 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years old, and they have patterns of the sky and calendars and all of these things. Amazing ecosystems in the ocean. We're looking at what oil does when it spills, and you have bacteria that grows and algae and the whole system. God says, I created the balance, the beauty, the gravitational poles. I mean, when you look at any one of these ecosystems, whether it's the ocean, whether it's plant life, whether it's animal life in the wild and how that it interacts and works, how there's checks and balances, there's even diseases that come in. When certain animals would become overpopulated, it's either predators that have to come in or disease comes in and takes it out, so where they go back to the balance of life. You get too many of one species, something has to bring that down so other things can survive. And God has put that in there. It's just amazing how the balance works. So, you do a little study about the earth. If Jupiter wasn't as big as Jupiter is, and the earth wasn't the size that it was, that earth is pulled between these two huge bodies so that we keep its rotation, keep the rotation that we have. We have this unique place in the universe where life can actually happen. By the planets or their distance from us, the moon, how its distance and how that it affects the oceans. Everything is so to the minute detail how it was laid out to where that life can actually exist on this earth. In fact, long before people had telescopes, the inspiration of the Spirit, and my favorite verses, of course, Psalms 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament showeth forth his handiwork, day unto day uttereth speech, night unto night showeth forth knowledge. There's no speech nor language where his voice, their voice, is not heard. Everything's crying out, everything's shouting, everything's saying, I made this. Hello, God made this. Everything shouts it out. So it's an amazing thing. So you really just have to decide which faith-based truth or claim best answers the question. How did various plants and animals develop? Was it evolution or was it creation? And the other one we want to look at was which theory explains the fossil record? The fossil record. For creation, we can look at an admission that Darwin actually made. Darwin, during his time, realized that this theory of it starting with one cell, and the further you would go back into the Earth's layers, you should see a progressive record. We kind of covered this a little bit last time. The deeper you go, the more simple the life forms would be. Darwin's admission was this. He says, why is there not in geological formations at every stratum full of such intermediate links? Where's the in-between links? He's saying, where do I find? How come when I dig things up, we don't see these intermediate links between different stages of life? Because the problem is you can't find different things in different places, is what he's saying. So, where are the transitional forms? Even Darwin asked this. Many paleontologists, the real boneheads like we talked about, these transitional forms do not exist. Darwin even admitted, he says, geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. Basically, Darwin is saying, look, the transitional forms aren't there. He said, okay, I admit they're not there. They should they should notice the conclusion. And this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. He says, if you can't find these, my whole theory kind of breaks down. He said that. If you can't find these things, then my Darwin's theory of evolution breaks down. It's not good. But they still haven't found it, and yet we have in our schools, our universities, all kinds of people that look at you and say, if you don't believe in evolution, you're the freak. You're the weirdo. You're the religious nut. And you're looking at them and say, talking about who's nuts? Hello? You have a lot of faith, and that's why the book's out there. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. So, Darwin's explanation. This explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. Did you hear what he said? He said, we haven't dug up enough. We haven't dug up enough. That's back in the 1800s. And the scientists then that come after me saying, just have faith in what I'm saying, but the scientists that come after me, when they do the research, I'm just the start of it, and I'm just checking this stuff out. But when time comes, transitional forms will be revealed. Just like we talked about last week, kicking the can. He's just kicking the can. It's coming, folks. It's going to be here. It'll happen one of these days. Just keep paying attention, and we'll make up enough stuff to make this happen. And you can, and I kind of left it out because it's near the end, but all of these Cro-Magnon man and all these different ones where they say they've found these different forms or skulls of men that are back in the Ice Age and are the early or transitionary men. You go back to each one of them, they've went through and found and actually analyzed these different ones. Remember Lucy was like this 3-foot tall one. Ever heard of Lucy? They found out that they pieced her together from this way and that way and that way and that way, put it together, and they said, it must be that. They said, it must be that. And even parts of the different skulls that they've come up and put them in the textbooks and put them in the magazines and said, oh, these are early man. These are the transitional ones. When they start analyzing them, it's a monkey skull or it's this skull or that. It has, or somebody that was severely deformed. When you actually look at the science of it. So there are no proofs that they make statements like, there are significant gaps in the fossil record. Yes, there certainly are, I guess. And so we're really asking 4 simple questions that have 2 alternatives, creation or evolution. How did life begin? How did various plants, all these variety of plants and animals come about? Single cell evolution, or God creates. And then what theory best explains the fossil record? Is it evolution? Is it creation? Darwinian evolution does not explain how life began or the fossil record. It doesn't explain human consciousness, rationality or morality. Where do these feelings come from? We start getting into morality and emotions and love. Love is one of those things in the sense of having that compassion on one another. How would that ever come out of evolution? How would that ever come out of just a natural selection? It comes from a creator. We're created in his very image. And so where is this sense of ought, of right, of wrong, of purpose, and the significance of the design of the universe? How many have heard of Dinesh D'Souza? You've heard that, yes. And he's very articulate. I think he has some podcast. He does have a podcast because I listened to it this morning while I was running. Him and his wife was a good one. But he began with a very sharp mind to examine. He wasn't always a Christian for sure, and I'm not going to go into his whole story, but he went through and examined the evidence and all the problems that people came up or what he thought were problems with Christianity. And his summary of his research, he talks about in his book, What's So Great About Christianity? I think that's the name of his book. And he writes this statement. He said, worldview clashes. In the secular account, you are the descendant of a tiny cell, a primordial protoplasm, washed up on an empty beach 3.5 billion years ago. You are a mere grab bag of atomic particles, a conglomeration of genetic substance. You exist on a tiny planet in a minute solar system in an empty corner of a meaningless universe. You came from nothing and you're going nowhere. Those are the logical conclusions of Darwinian macroevolution. That sounds so enlightening. He said, in the Christian view, by contrast, you are the special creation of a good and all-powerful God. You are the climax of his creation. Not only is your kind unique, but you are unique among your kind. You're peculiar. Your Creator loves you so much and so intensely that he desires your companionship and affection, and that he gave the life of his only Son that you might have or spend eternity with him. That's creation. That is God. And so we've went through and covered some of these basic questions, and I want to dig into a couple more tonight, and then we're going to kind of hit it a different way next week. But the last question, we talked about the fossil record. Darwin has his doubts and his concerns that someday, okay, go on. So let's look at this for a little bit further down here. The first discovery, we want to look at another subject called the Big Bang. The first discovery is in astronomy or physics. The Big Bang theory is interesting history, and so let's look at this for a little bit. Another quote by Dinesh D'Souza does a great job of looking back over history and summarizing what's happened in the Big Bang. He writes, By the 20th century, Albert Einstein published his equation of general relativity, and then a Dutch astronomer named Willem de Sitter found a solution to them that predicted an expanding universe. This too is a highly significant prediction, because if the universe has been expanding, and if the galaxies were moving farther and farther apart, this implies that in the past they were once closer together. If the universe has been blowing up and blowing out for its duration, that means that it must have had an actual beginning. That's one thing that science has brought out, that the universe has always been expanding, continuing to expand. Well, that it had to expand from a point. It had to start and keeps moving outward. It's not, at one point they're saying, oh, it's going in and out like a pulse, but that's not proven any way, shape, or form. There's no way or gravitational force that would bring it back in. But it's been proven through science, through astronomy, that it's expanding, continuing to expand. In the late 1920s, Edwin Hubble, of the famous now Hubble telescope, peering through a 100-inch telescope at Mount Wilson Observatory in California, observed the red shift of distant nebulae, that the galaxies were moving rapidly away from one another. The number of stars that were involved and dispersed suggested an astounding, far more vast universe than scientists ever imagined. How many have seen like Louis Giglio's stuff, Indescribable? You've never seen that? You should. Look them up on YouTube. They're out there. What's the other ones? Indescribable. There's about 2 or 3 of them. But he brings out the universe. He brings out how huge the stars are and how small our star is compared to the other stars that are out there, and how small we are compared to the other things that are out there, and how huge our universe is. Maybe we'll do that sometime. But it just blows your mind away how big. It makes you feel very, very small. You're like, ooh, and yet God holds it in his hands. He's got it all. Scientists realized right away that the galaxies were flying apart, not because of some mysterious force thrusting them away from one another. Rather, they were moving apart because they were flung apart by an explosion. Extrapolating backward in time, all the galaxies seem to have one common point of origin, approximately, and they put their timelines to it, approximately 15 billion years ago. So, then in a single cosmic explosion, the Big Bang, the universe that we inhabit came into existence. The universe was filled with light. Steven Weinberg, that we talked about him last week, that scientist who was driven to disprove Christianity, his whole motivation, I'm going to be a scientist, I'm going to go to be a scientist to disprove religion, disprove God, writes, it was light, he speaks about it, it was light that then formed the dominant constituent of the universe. So we're going to bring out some quotes about even non-Christian scientists, what they acknowledge, this moving, this expanding universe, how it all came from one central point, all of these things. So let's look at the evidence. He says something akin, what he's saying is that all of a sudden there's all this light that came out, equivalent to what we already know when God said, let there be light. Okay, now I bring these out because the less they know about the Bible and they start studying, keep studying, the more they don't even understand that they're proving the Bible. And those that know the Bible, they skirt around it and say, well, I have to prove this way and I have to prove that way, and I got to be careful how I say these things. And they get upset when some of these ones that are ignorant plunge right in the middle of it and expose it with scientific proof. And you're like, oh, thank you so much. I'm glad you spent those millions of dollars to find that out. At least our tax dollars are going to something good that way. Okay. So the science shows the theory of expanding universe was consistent with data, with the second law of thermodynamics, and also Einstein's theory. At the first, the Big Bang theory was rejected, but as results started coming in, it was more and more plausible. They rejected it because the notion of a Big Bang would imply that there was a moment of creation in which everything, the universe and its laws, came into existence. So edging closer to saying, yes, all of a sudden something came from nothing. It was created. And I believe that God's voice is big enough to sound like a big bang. But anyway, so ultimately the admission that comes into view is that the universe had a beginning. So with all the discoveries and data, which theory answers the question of a universe with a beginning? Evolution or creation? The fossil records refute this claim of evolution, that everything develops slowly over millions of years. There's a thing they call the Cambrian explosion, where all of life seems to explode onto the scene. They're like, for a long time, millions and billions of years, all we had was this slow-moving growth and little protoplasms and little sea fish or things in the sea. Life wasn't growing. Things weren't happening. And I was just listening to some couple of really nerdy-looking scientists last night explain the Cambrian explosion. And you're like, And they say, well, we think that all of a sudden it was kind of sitting in this retarded mode of growth because there was not enough oxygen that had been developed yet. But as plants began to develop more, then more oxygen came. And then when the oxygen came, then all of a sudden, woof, everything started growing. And that's how they explain the Cambrian explosion. They're seeing all of this life, all of this greenery, all of these animals, all of these things, and they can't explain how all of a sudden for billions of years all this stuff, all this, and they're just making conjecture, and they try to stretch it out as long as they possibly can, so that they can say that all of these things came from this little blob that was hit by lightning and all of these things. But we'll get into the probability of that. It doesn't even make sense. Okay. The Big Bang begins to say, wait a minute, there was a moment. The fossil record, instead of this slow graduated growth, they find this section in the geological structure where bursting out at one time instead of a slow multiple, every type of animal ever happened, all of a sudden came into existence. So the third thing, we look at the Big Bang, but let's look at the molecular biology just a little bit. Lee Strobel did a great job of summarizing this in a few paragraphs, and he wrote some books that deal in apologetics, but he talked about molecular biology. Means that what actually happened inside the cell. Evolution used to be a lot easier for many scientists to accept because not too many years ago, they didn't see a big gap between non-living matter and basic living things. Darwin, after all, only had that tiny microscope that would only multiply to a couple hundred times. So when he looked at the single-cell organism through the microscope, it looked pretty uncomplicated. In fact, Darwin himself used the word simple. It's a simple cell to describe a single-cell organism. All he could see when he looked through the microscope was a roundish mass that was surrounded by a membrane with a semi-fluid liquid. In fact, even 50, 60 years ago, the textbooks that were read, if you're that old, you may have read them back 50, 60 years ago. But anyway, made statements that inside the nucleus is actually nothing but a clear liquid. They didn't even know DNA was in there 50, 60 years ago. But today, thanks to the more powerful microscopes that we now have, then research has been done, they realize that that single cell is incredibly complex. In fact, it's so complicated. You got your nerdy brain caps on right now? Okay. This could get like, can we move on from the science? Some people are eating it up, and some people are like, I understand that. And normally it's not like that. And we'll get into more of the biblical side of it next week. But I like the nerdy stuff. Okay, so in fact, it's so complicated that the greatest computers cannot fully understand it. It's a cell multiplied thousands of times shows us the DNA. The DNA alone, there's code within the DNA. There are 3.1 billion letters just in one single DNA strand. The molecular structure shows how it all works. Single-cell organisms are high-tech factories. They're complete with artificial languages and decoding systems. They have central memory banks that store and retrieve impressive amounts of information. They have precise control systems that regulate the automatic assembly of the components. They have proofreading and quality control mechanisms that safeguard against errors. I was reading a book, it's been a couple years ago, and they deal with fasting and deal with how your body cleans itself up when you do fasting and things like that. And they have a thing called autophagy. And when autophagy starts kicking in after you've not eaten for enough time, for a certain amount of time, it kicks in at different points for different people, depending on how well your body's adapted to it. Some may take a lot longer because you've got a lot of reserves. Just saying. But when your body goes into autophagy and it starts cleaning itself up, and instead of starving itself or taking from here or whatever, it'll start actually cleaning up. If you start fasting it'll start cleaning up the cells. It'll start cleaning up the cells. And it'll start kicking out the bad things and start taking out the bad things out of your cells, clean them up, get rid of the bad stuff, repair when your body starts going into a starvation mode. And they call that autophagy. But anyway, the living cell, far from being simple, is one of the most complex things on the earth. It's very difficult to believe that it could just happen by chance. When we get into the facts here, it couldn't happen by chance. In fact, one researcher in a scientific journal explains what has to happen in one single cell for life to be viable. A simple cell would need a vast number of parts. And I wanted to get a diagram because there's just one little cell that you can't, he said in that one cell, at least 239 protein molecules, each containing 445 amino acids. So they're talking about proteins and acids and all this stuff got together and got hit by lightning. You're like, eh. All of which are made up of 10 to 20 atoms. Of the hundreds of amino acids, only 20 are used in the protein. So there's all kinds of amino acids, but there's only a select few that are in a human cell. And they can't simply float around randomly. They have to have order. All 445 of them must be lined up in a single line in perfect sequential order for a protein to function. For a single cell to spring to life, 445 amino acids would have to accidentally line up perfectly, not once, but 239 times to form 29 proteins, which would make a living cell. Now, the odds of this happening randomly are not even something that we can even comprehend. We can't even comprehend it. They've used the analogy of like if you took 10 pennies, we're talking just 10 pennies, and you name them, you put 1 through 10, wrote it on there, and then you put them in your pocket. The probability of you reaching in your pocket and pulling it out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 10 is like 10 to the 20th. I mean, just this phenomenal number that you can't even comprehend. All of these, like 20 zeros behind it. And they're just talking 10 by 10. We're talking 450 by all of the 250. That's a number that you can't even comprehend. And they're saying, oh, but by chance, after all these different attempts, that's a lot of lightning strikes. But they had billions of years, and how could you know? And I heard a man debating about this, and he said, well, the probability, and he said something about the probability, and he said, well, it could be probable. And I'm looking at it, I was like, no, it couldn't. That's why non-Christian scientists who are looking at the evidence are looking at this evidence and saying, this can't happen by chance. Non-Christian scientists say, this can't happen by chance. No matter how many billions of years you could add to your equation, which was the safeguard against in the past, they could get away with this argument. It looked like just use a long time and we can get away with the argument until we see how complex this one single cell is. The probability of that happening once, and all that you would have is this one, even if you had it to happen once, you get one cell for one being. For one being. And you have all of these beings, all of these species, all of these animals, all of these plants that are supposed to develop by this one cell that could never happen by chance in the first place. This is Charles Darwin. If it could be demonstrated, Darwin said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. I think his theory broke down. What is being declared? It's been demonstrated your theory breaks down. So with the most recent discoveries in astronomy and physics and the fossil record and molecular biology, you make the choice. What makes the most sense? Now some are saying, okay, now let's talk, take a little more moment about, what do we got here? I got a few minutes. DNA. Every DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA is what that is. That's where they get that from. Deoxyribo or ribonucleic, that's the N, acid, is part of every cell that contains the genetic code. Every living thing, even the most basic, contain this DNA. The DNA we have has millions of component parts that are called nucleates, and they are arranged in a very specific sequence. Think of DNA as a way to picture it. It's like the software of the cell. It's like the computer program that makes it work. The DNA orchestrates or functions in a way so that all of the cell and all of its growth can replicate with explicit accuracy. These days, with scientific advances, we can store a lot of information. The information age has been blowing up. The amount of information, how it's stored, the storage information has progressed exponentially. Okay, we'll get some history here. I've just listed a few of the way that we used to store information. How many remember, we can get some of the old people, how many remember punch cards for storing information? Ooh, how about microfiche? I remember going to the parts store and they'd look it up. Let me look on the microfiche here. A way of doing it. The library, go there, things like that. There was a thing called magnetic cones or drums. Was the way that was the 50s and 60s. Tapes, all various types of tapes. Floppy disks, remember those? That's what I learned in the 80s was floppy disks, how to program on an Apple computer. There we go. Cut the side out of the one disc so you could copy on both sides of it or whatever. CDs, flash drives, zip disks, DVDs, flash drives, and SD cards. And then cloud storage, where they put stuff on the clouds. That's according to Kamala, when she's trying to explain how information is stored. Oh yes, they've got it to where it's stored up in the clouds. And you look and you're like, are you serious? I think she said it with kind of a straight face. And then we have all the, the different sizes of hard drives, external hard drives, and even, it's amazing what kind of storage that we have. But we need to know that compared to the DNA that God put in our body in every living being, what man has invented is nothing compared to the DNA, to how that God put that into play and how much information is stored in every living being and each cell within every living being. The genetic information in DNA in a microscopic single-cell organism, if it was spelled out in English, would equal the whole volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica. If, when you were in your mother's womb, the size of a dot, if you could go in there and remove the DNA and uncoil it, it would be 6 feet tall and would have code on it, precise instructions. When it's just a very dot within mom, would be everything on there, precise instructions for piecing together every part of your body, from your 600 muscles to your 2 million optic nerves to your 100 billion nerve cells that are in your body. That was done by chance and happenstance. DNA is unbelievable. It's not the mere existence, but it's complexity. It's the divine computer program that demonstrates that there must have been a programmer. World-class expert in chemistry of DNA, Robert Shapiro, not the lawyer, who is an evolutionist, was asked, what do you think are the chances that DNA could have been formed by random process. This is an evolutionist. The answer, he said, none. Absolutely nonsense. He said that. Not even having faith in God, he said, nah, can't happen. Because he studied it. He saw how complex that it was. This couldn't happen by chance. Dr. Francis Crick, who shared the Nobel Peace Prize for discovering DNA, or I don't think he really discovered DNA. I think he discovered the part of hereditary, how to piece together and use it for family, how it interrelates with family, sons, daughters, all that stuff in the 50s. But he is convinced that life could not have ever evolved from non-living matter on the earth. Okay, so let's change it up a little bit. Let's look at the big picture for a moment. We got a few more minutes. Evolution, Darwinian macroevolution, not microevolution within species, but cross-species. The premise among non-Christian scientists of our day is that it's a faith issue. They are believing that this is true. They're just believing it. They're just believing that evolution is true. They're just believing these things are true. And if you don't believe the way that they believe, then you're the one that's not right. And it's a faith thing. That's what I'm trying to tell us, or bring it out, is that it's a faith thing. They have to have more faith to believe what they believe than we have. And they get mad about it because they can't prove any of it. Even though that they've said, it's been proven, it's not a theory, it's a fact. But the theory was never proved. I don't know how they moved from theory to fact. I think it's just that they shouted louder. They just kept shouting it, putting it in textbook, putting different things in there that were never proven, and just people kept building it. And one thing I brought out quite a while ago was that a lot of times people believe in evolution just because they believe somebody else believes in it. That professor believes it. Well, he's a smart fella. He must believe in it. I'm going to leave the smart fella part in there. Leave that alone. Anyway. Genetic code sequencing. Okay. Which theory or claim has the greatest moral or social benefit? If something's true, if something is positive, you would expect it to have a positive, fruitful impact in our relationships and life. So let's look at the moral and social benefits of Darwinism. Darwinism or humanism. God is dethroned. Man becomes the center of the universe. Humanism just means that man is in charge. What Darwin did is freed humankind and made it intellectually acceptable to be an atheist. So there's no more moral constraints because there's no God, there's no moral constraints. Instead of God and his law and morally saying this is right, this is wrong, man is the center instead of God being the center. And so we have to decide. Man ultimately decides what is good. That's what they believe. Man ultimately decides what is good, what is right, what is wrong, who has value, and who doesn't have value. That statement in itself there, when you look at that, you're like, oh, that's okay. But when you realize where they're actually teaching from, and they start deciding who has value and who doesn't have value, and you'll start finding out who the real racists are. And I have some quotes in there, and I don't even think I want to read them, from Darwin and some of these other ones about racism. Man ultimately decides what is good, what is wrong. So what should we do? What should we not do is what they decide. That's what humanism is. This grew out of the thinking of Darwinism applied to social relationships. Relative truth is birthed and moral absolutes are discarded. Relative truth. We're hearing these things. It's amazing. I'm going through this like, this is what's going on in our nation today. This is what we're hearing over the news. There's quotes you're hearing from Kamala dealing with Marxism, things that are being brought out, and you're like, that's evil. And they throw it in there. They throw it in there, and they don't let you know that's absolutely Marxism. That's communism. Her dad was a Marxist. And things that I just stick to the paper. Okay. Believe it or not, there was a time when people actually believed there was right and there was wrong. Believe it or not. You didn't have to agree with it, but there was a standard. Not everybody went to church, but everybody believed there was a right and a wrong. That's not true anymore. The pluralistic view is It's an arrogant and intolerant to in any way say that your view of what is right or wrong are better than anybody else. You're wrong if you say an absolute truth. You're the bad guy if you say that this is a principle that we can stand on. And they're attacking Christianity with this. All truth claims they say, all truth claims, your truth, my truth, their truth, all have equal footing. What I want you to know is this grew out of Darwin's survival of the fittest. These things that we're hearing came out of this type of teaching all the way back to Darwin. This is what happened when intellects began to take and say, you know what? There's no God, so who's to determine what's right? Humanism. What is true? Man is the standard. Man is the one that makes these things up. We have morals, we have situational ethics, which led to the sexual revolution. People wrote, let's make love, not war, all these things. And I'm not going to go all through history and all that, how that evolved. But it wasn't until the sexual revolution that we saw the disintegration of the family, HIV positive, AIDS, all this stuff. We have a plague in the world that's incurable. There are costs when you take morality out of society. There are costs when you take the truth out of society. We have an epidemic of divorce, single parenthood, all kinds of social plagues. The mindset of it, if it feels good, do it. That's what's been preached for the last 40 years. If it feels good, do it. And most of us know that gets you in a bad spot. There's nothing more than the roots of Darwinism applied to a godless generation. They even try to give meaning to things that don't have any meaning. They do. They try to put meaning on things. Here's one for, look at a modern art show, throwing paint everywhere and saying, wow, that's cool. That's enlightening, right? They have abstract art and all that stuff, and you're supposed to pretend that that's, wow. And then people pay millions of dollars for it, so then it must be right. All of that is rooted in what? If your origin is random chance, no purpose, no designer, no God, that's what you come up with. Nonsense. Nonsense. If you're just a blob on this little part of the solar system in a little planet, then it is absolutely intellectually consistent to say there is no meaning to life. And that's where it all kind of comes back to. There's no meaning to life. And so the only meaning is to have an experience. You have to get a meaning from just your experience, from even a negative experience of any type. And who's to tell anyone what to do? Who are you to tell what's right and what's wrong? And that's what we see flowing on the television and the movies and books, and more violence today is nothing more than a decade after decade of the erosion of truth. It's just been trying to tear down what's right, tearing it down, So let's go from humanism and morality to Darwinism and social relationships. Darwinism applied to racism, Nazism, sexism, Marxism. In other words, if it's survival of the fittest, we should keep the best of the race. That's where it talks about survival. That's where it stems from, best of the race. We should look at men and women and decide who is more important and act accordingly. And if you get into some of these types of mindsets, you can actually go into like Obamacare and some of the things and the way they were trying to decide who got to live and who didn't get to live. Yeah. When they talk about old people and how they treated old people and how certain things, people that were disabled and all that stuff, you get into the fine print of all that. There was things that were cut off once you became a liability. Yeah. And so it goes into that type of things. And they talk about population control. We get into Marxism when it comes to things like that. And we don't have time to continue with that tonight. But next week, we might just cover some of those things a little bit more. Tend to get a little political, not trying to so much, but just try to teach the truth. Amen. But then we want to get into some of the biblical truth and how creation. We'll go into Genesis, a little part where I just love going into. This is like a lot of information. I know I get buried with it, and we're reading a lot of things, but it'll be a lot more next week. Pretty fun dealing with creation, get into dinosaurs and all that kind of stuff, and how things were kind of put into play. So with that, let's pray. Lord, we thank you tonight for your truth, for your word, for your promises. Lord, that we can look at the facts, that we can study and look at what's right and what's wrong. And we know that it proves what actually took place, your word, your truth, and that we can know exactly the direction we're going. We ask these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen.